Pulling away without warning isn't about being cold. It's about being done. When you stop explaining, announcing, or preparing someone for your absence, you interrupt the pattern they felt safe relying on. And it's in that quiet, unexpected distance that the ego finally feels what your presence was really worth. When emotional distance appears suddenly, it disrupts one of the ego's deepest comforts, predictability. Control doesn't always look like dominance or manipulation. Often it looks like certainty. Certainty that you'll reply. Certainty that you'll care. Certainty that no matter what happens, you'll still be there to engage, explain, or soften the moment. When that certainty vanishes without warning, the ego loses its footing. It doesn't just feel distance, it feels instability. Most people don't realize how much emotional access they assume until it's gone. Consistency can quietly turn into entitlement. Your presence, your responsiveness, your emotional availability become part of the environment, expected, not appreciated. The ego builds its sense of control on that expectation. It feels powerful not because it dominates, but because it knows where it stands. Sudden distance shatters that knowledge. The rules change without notice, and the ego has no script for what comes next. What makes this kind of pullback so impactful is that it doesn't invite negotiation. There's no conversation to steer, no explanation to reinterpret, no emotion to manage. You're not announcing a boundary and waiting to see if it will be respected. You're enforcing it through action. That action communicates something words rarely can. Access to you is not guaranteed. And once that realization lands, control weakens immediately. The ego struggles most when it can't trace cause and effect. If you argue, it can blame conflict. If you explain, it can analyze your words. If you threaten to leave, it can adjust behavior temporarily. But when you pull away calmly and without warning, there's no clear lever to pull. The ego doesn't know whether to apologize, pursue, dismiss, or defend. That uncertainty creates discomfort because control thrives on knowing how to respond. There's also a deeper layer here. Sudden emotional distance forces self-reflection, even in people who avoid it. Without your reactions to focus on, attention turns inward. Questions emerge that were easy to avoid before. Did I take this for granted? Did I misjudge how much I mattered? Did I assume too much security? These questions aren't planted by confrontation. They arise naturally from absence. And because they're self-generated, they carry more weight. From your perspective, pulling away without warning is often the moment you stop managing someone else's comfort. You no longer cushion the impact of your needs or soften your truth to keep the peace. That shift can feel unfamiliar at first, especially if you're used to being considerate, responsive, or emotionally available, even at your own expense. But what you gain is clarity. You see how much energy you were giving simply to maintain equilibrium. And once you step back, you realize how unbalanced that effort had become. The ego experiences this loss of control as a threat, not because you did something dramatic, but because you did something decisive. You chose yourself without asking permission. That autonomy is unsettling to anyone who unconsciously relied on your predictability to feel secure or superior. The sudden distance reveals that the power they felt wasn't inherent, it was borrowed from your availability. Importantly, this isn't about punishment. You're not pulling away to provoke panic or remorse. You're responding to a truth you've already accepted, that continuing as before no longer serves you. The ego feels it precisely because there's no hostility to push against. There's only a quiet shift in reality. When control is broken this way, it doesn't explode, it dissolves. And in that dissolution, something else becomes clear. The moment you stop being predictable at your own expense is the moment you reclaim your power. When there is warning, the ego prepares. It adjusts its behavior, rehearses responses, and finds ways to minimize loss. Apologies may appear, promises may surface, attention may suddenly increase. None of this necessarily comes from deep awareness, it often comes from self-preservation. A warning gives the ego time to manage the narrative and regain control. But when you pull away without notice, that preparation never happens, and the impact lands fully. The ego is highly skilled at adaptation. If it senses that access is at risk, it can temporarily become attentive, reflective, or affectionate. It can mirror your needs just enough to stabilize the situation. This is why repeated warnings rarely change dynamics long term. They teach the ego how to respond just enough to keep you engaged. Over time, the pattern becomes predictable, discomfort arises, you express it, the ego adjusts briefly, and then everything slides back to where it was. Control is preserved, and nothing truly shifts. Removing warning disrupts this cycle. There is no early signal to trigger damage control, no chance to say the right thing at the right time, no opportunity to reframe events or present a version of themselves that keeps the connection intact. The loss arrives before the ego can protect itself, and that's what makes it register as real. It's not a threat anymore, it's an outcome. Without preparation time, the ego also loses its ability to manipulate perception. It can't tell itself that the situation is temporary or that it's still in charge. The absence forces confrontation with reality as it is, not as it was assumed to be. That reality is simple but uncomfortable. Something changed, and it changed without permission. From a psychological standpoint, surprise intensifies awareness. When expectations are violated abruptly, the brain pays attention. Gradual shifts are easier to rationalize or ignore. Sudden ones demand explanation. When you pull away without warning, the ego can't easily dismiss the loss as emotional fluctuation. The contrast is too sharp. One moment there was access, consistency, and engagement. The next there isn't. That gap creates impact. On your side, choosing not to warn often comes after a long internal process. It's rarely impulsive. Most people who pull away quietly have already tried explaining, waiting, hoping, or adjusting. By the time they stop showing up, clarity has replaced confusion. The decision is already made. And because it's made internally, it doesn't need external validation. That internal certainty is what removes the need for announcement. Not giving warning is also an act of self-protection. Warnings invite negotiation, guilt, and emotional bargaining. They open the door to being talked out of your own boundary. Pulling away without note closes that door gently but firmly. It allows you to honor your decision without being pulled back into a cycle that already showed you its limits. The ego feels this deeply because it cannot attribute the loss to miscommunication or timing. There was no conversation to hide behind, no moment to reinterpret. The only conclusion available is that access was removed because it was no longer deserved or safe. That realization can be uncomfortable, but it's also clarifying. Importantly, this doesn't make you cruel. You're not obligated to prepare someone for your absence when staying costs you your peace. You're allowed to leave once you know. And when you do so without warning, the ego feels the full weight of consequence, not because you intended harm, but because you stopped preventing it. One of the strongest assumptions the ego makes is permanence. When someone shows up consistently, cares deeply, and remains available even when things are unbalanced, the ego begins to treat that presence as a constant rather than a choice. Availability turns into expectation. Effort turns into background noise. And over time, what was once valued becomes taken for granted. Pulling away without warning breaks that illusion in an instant. Most people don't consciously decide to take someone for granted. It happens gradually. The ego notices that no matter how it behaves, you're still there. You still respond. You still try. You still adjust. That reliability creates a sense of safety, but also complacency. The ego stops checking in with itself. It stops asking whether it's meeting you with the same care you offer. Instead, it assumes continuity. And assumptions are comfortable until they're wrong. When you stop showing up without explanation, that premise collapses. The ego is forced to confront a reality it avoided. Your presence was not guaranteed. It was earned, sustained, and chosen. And once that choice is withdrawn, the loss feels sharper than if it had been threatened or discussed. The shock doesn't come from the distance itself, but from the realization that something assumed permanent was always conditional. What makes this so impactful is contrast. Before, you were part of the emotional landscape, steady, predictable, and engaged. After, there is space where you used to be. The mind naturally fills that space with reflection. Moments are replayed, patterns are re-examined. The ego begins to recognize how much it relied on your presence without acknowledging it. And because this awareness arrives too late to change the outcome, it lands with weight. From your perspective, pulling away often comes after you've already loosened your internal attachment. You may have slowly realized that your effort wasn't being matched, or that your presence was being assumed rather than appreciated. When you finally step back, it's not a dramatic break. It's a quiet correction. You stop offering what was no longer valued, and that shift restores balance, not externally but within you. The ego struggles with this because it confuses reliability with loyalty and loyalty with obligation. It begins to believe that because you've stayed before, you'll stay again. That belief can create carelessness, not intentional harm, but inattention. Boundaries get pushed, effort declines, accountability softens. When you pull away without warning, you interrupt that pattern and expose the faulty belief beneath it. There's also a deeper emotional reckoning that follows. The ego has to reconcile the idea that you left not because of a single event, but because of accumulated imbalance. That's harder to dismiss. A single conflict can be minimized. A gradual loss of presence reflects a longer truth. And when you leave quietly, the ego is left alone with that truth, without the comfort of your reassurance or engagement. Importantly, pulling away doesn't erase what existed. It reframes it. What once felt stable now feels fragile. What once felt secure now feels uncertain. And that reframing can't be undone by explanation or persuasion. The assumption has already been broken. For you, this moment often brings a sense of relief. You no longer feel the pressure to maintain something out of habit or hope. You remember that your presence is a choice, not a duty. And once you reclaim that awareness, you move differently, more intentionally, more selectively, more rooted in self-respect. The ego feels the loss because it assumed continuity. You regain yourself because you remembered choice. Silence after consistency creates a psychological vacuum that's impossible to ignore. When someone is used to your steady presence, your replies, your engagement, your emotional availability, the sudden absence of that rhythm stands out more than any argument ever could. Consistency trains expectation. It tells the nervous system what to rely on. When that pattern breaks without explanation, awareness sharpens immediately. The mind looks for the missing beat. What makes silence so powerful here is contrast. If you were distant all along, your absence wouldn't register. But when you've been present, responsive, and emotionally engaged, silence becomes loud. It highlights what was there by showing what is no longer offered. The ego can ignore complaints. It can dismiss emotional conversations. But it cannot ignore a broken pattern. The shift is too clear. Something has changed, and it changed decisively. The ego often lives comfortably inside routine. It gets used to how things work, how you show up, how much effort you'll make, how quickly you'll respond. That routine becomes a baseline. Once established, it fades into the background. Appreciation decreases not because value is gone, but because familiarity dulls attention. Silence disrupts that familiarity. It forces the ego to look directly at what it had grown comfortable overlooking. After consistency, silence feels personal, even when it isn't meant to punish. The ego experiences it as a loss of access, not just communication. There's no reassurance to stabilize the situation, no interaction to reinterpret. The mind fills the quiet with questions. Did I misread things? Did I push too far? Did I assume too much? These questions arise not because you asked them, but because your absence created space for them. From your side, silence after consistency often reflects a shift that's been building internally. You didn't disappear impulsively. You noticed patterns. You felt the imbalance. You recognized that your effort was sustaining something that wasn't sustaining you. When you stop engaging, it's not a tactic, it's alignment. You're no longer acting out of habit or hope. You're acting out of clarity. The ego struggles with this because silence offers no leverage. There's no emotional tone to respond to, no anger to counter, no explanation to debate. Silence leaves the ego alone with itself. And for someone who relied on your engagement to feel grounded or validated, that aloneness is uncomfortable. The absence of reaction removes the familiar emotional feedback loop. Silence also removes the illusion that connection can be maintained without care. Consistency often masks imbalance. As long as you keep showing up, the ego doesn't have to reflect on its own effort. When you go quiet, that mask falls away. The connection either stands on mutual investment or it collapses under the weight of one-sidedness. What makes this kind of silence so effective is that it's not performative. You're not withholding to provoke a response. You're withdrawing because participation no longer feels honest. That authenticity changes the energy completely. The silence isn't tense or resentful. It's settled. And that calm absence is far more destabilizing than emotional confrontation because it signals finality rather than frustration. Over time, the ego begins to recognize the difference between noise and presence. It may realize that what it misses isn't conversation, but the sense of being met, understood, and emotionally supported. That realization often comes too late to reverse the outcome, but it reshapes perception nonetheless. For you, silence restores internal balance. You're no longer overextending to maintain connection. You're no longer explaining yourself into exhaustion. You return to yourself. And in doing so, you demonstrate something quietly powerful. When consistency is no longer reciprocated, silence becomes self-respect. Pulling away without warning is one of the clearest ways to shift power back to yourself. Power isn't about dominating or controlling someone else. It's about controlling your own choices, your energy, and your emotional boundaries. As long as you remain reactive, engaged, or available on someone else's terms, the dynamic favors them. You are participating in a game they are set up to win. The moment you withdraw without announcement, you reclaim authority over your own presence, and suddenly the balance tilts. Many people misunderstand withdrawal as punishment, but in reality, it's about self-alignment. You're no longer reacting to ego manipulation or expectation. You're no longer negotiating your presence to maintain stability, earn approval, or avoid conflict. Instead, you make a deliberate choice. Your attention, care, and energy are yours to give only where they are valued. That shift in agency is immediately apparent to anyone who assumed it could be taken for granted. The ego feels this shift intensely because it is normal to measuring power through engagement. Arguments, emotional responses, debates, and explanations all provide it a sense of influence. Even when you're assertive, the ego knows the pattern. It says something, you respond, control is temporarily balanced or contested, and then the cycle continues. Withdrawal interrupts this rhythm. You remove the input entirely. There is no response, no argument, no explanation. Control collapses because it cannot operate in a vacuum. Sudden withdrawal also forces self-reflection. When someone has relied on your presence, your guidance, attention, or emotional labor, your disappearance highlights the space where you once were. That space cannot be ignored, rationalized away, or argued with. The ego begins to measure what was lost, often for the first time. It doesn't matter that no words were exchanged. Absence itself communicates value, necessity, and impact. From your perspective, pulling away quietly is an act of emotional and psychological sway. You are choosing where and how to expend your energy. You are refusing to be drawn into the continuous cycle of expectation and disappointment. By doing so, you reclaim time, space, and mental clarity that were previously invested in maintaining a dynamic that no longer serves you. It is an empowering shift because it removes the illusion that your attention is a given. You make it conditional on alignment and respect, not on obligation or guilt. The ego struggles with this because it loses its reference point. When access is immediate and predictable, the ego can manipulate, provoke, or secure validation. Sudden absence removes that opportunity. There's no argument to dominate, no praise to inflate, no engagement to exploit. That vacuum creates unease because it exposes the truth. Influence over you was never inherent. It relied entirely on your presence. Importantly, this shift doesn't require dramatics. You do not need to announce your removal, justify it, or create tension. The power of unannounced absence lies in its subtlety. The ego cannot counteract something it doesn't see coming. It feels the effect before it understands the cause. That combination of invisibility and consequence is devastatingly effective because it communicates authority without aggression. Over time, this withdrawal can bring clarity to both sides. The ego begins to recognize the limits of its influence, and you begin to reclaim confidence in your ability to set boundaries. You understand that you don't need to argue, threaten, or negotiate for respect. It is communicated naturally through your choices. By simply removing yourself, you demonstrate that real power isn't about reaction or confrontation. It's about decisive, calm self-determination. Pulling away without warning ultimately reshapes the dynamic in a permanent way. You no longer react from habit or expectation, you choose intentionally. That intentionality is a quiet but undeniable form of authority. The ego notices immediately, not because you told it to, but because your absence speaks volumes. In that silence, the balance of power returns to its rightful place, with you. The ego experiences loss most intensely when it cannot assign blame. Drama, arguments, and confrontations give it something to target: a word, a tone, a misstep. When you disappear or pull away quietly, there's nothing to attack. There's no villain, no explanation, no justification. The absence itself carries all the weight, and that is what makes it so unsettling. Without a clear culprit, the ego has to sit with the reality of the consequence. Your presence is no longer available. That realization forces reflection in a way that anger, manipulation, or confrontation never could. One of the ego's primary survival mechanisms is control through cause and effect. It thrives when it can trace a problem back to an action or manipulate circumstances to maintain its influence. If a conflict arises, the ego can argue, defend, or redirect attention. If someone expresses hurt, the ego can rationalize, placate, or charm their way back into relevance. But when you quietly withdraw, there is no action to dissect, no misstep to debate, no emotional reaction to manipulate. The absence is the only signal, and it is final. That finality leaves the ego disoriented because it cannot assign fault or regain leverage. The power of disappearing without blame lies in its neutrality. You are not punishing, judging, or retaliating. You are simply making a choice aligned with your own well-being. That calm and impartial decision removes the emotional ammunition the ego relies on. It cannot frame the situation as unfair, unjust, or dramatic because you have not provided a narrative to fight against. The absence communicates without accusation, and the ego cannot respond to a silent truth. From your perspective, this type of withdrawal is liberating. You no longer need to justify your choices or manage someone else's perception of them. You are free to act according to your values rather than their expectations. That freedom is powerful precisely because it is quiet. There is no spectacle, no argument, no emotional display, just a clear boundary enforced through action, not through words. In reclaiming your energy this way, you demonstrate that self-respect is not contingent on recognition, approval, or response. The ego feels this loss acutely because it thrives on relational dynamics. It measures importance through attention, validation, and influence. Once these are removed, it begins to assess what it truly relied upon: your presence, your energy, your engagement. The absence cannot be ignored, rationalized, or explained away. And the more the ego tries to grasp for control, the more obvious the loss becomes. Unlike drama or confrontation, this absence is unambiguous. The message is clear, access is not guaranteed, and it is no longer available. There is also a psychological subtlety at work. When the ego cannot assign blame, it is forced to confront its own role in the dynamic. Without someone to accuse, it must reflect inward, even if unconsciously, and consider patterns of entitlement, neglect, or dependence on your availability. That reflection is uncomfortable because it cannot be redirected outward. There is no narrative to manipulate, only reality to face. Your energy and presence were given, and now they are withdrawn. Importantly, this approach is not about cruelty or revenge. It is an act of self-preservation and clarity. You are not trying to make someone suffer, you are simply reclaiming what is yours: your attention, your emotional space, your boundaries. And the ego feels the weight of that reclamation precisely because it has nowhere to project its confusion or frustration. By removing access calmly, without warning, and without drama, you shift the dynamic entirely. The ego experiences loss in its purest form, undeniable, unmediated, and unavoidable. It is a loss that cannot be justified away or argued against because there is no incident to debate. The absence itself becomes the lesson, teaching the ego that control over you was never inherent, but borrowed from your willingness to remain. And in that quiet, invisible shift, your power is fully restored, and the ego is left to reckon with the reality it cannot change. Pulling away without warning isn't about drama, revenge, or punishment. It's about reclaiming your energy, your boundaries, and your peace. When you step back quietly, the ego no longer has access to manipulate, control, or rely on your presence. That absence speaks louder than words ever could. True power lies in calm, decisive action, in choosing yourself without explanation, and in letting reality show the impact of your withdrawal. In that silence, you regain control, restore balance, and display that self-respect is far stronger than any reaction you could provoke.